Well, hi there, SPE 223. Let's see here. Share, 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 I guess. How do I move this? Okay, let's move you down. Okay, welcome to my applied assignment view slideshow. Beautiful. So quick overview of what I'll discuss today. We've got pre-work, new learning solutions, and continued inquiry. Let's dive right in. So I chose to research the inclusion, equity, and access of individuals with disabilities in our educational system. I also have incorporated how stereotypes and cultural differences play a role in shaping inclusion. Why you ask? Because some of you may already know that I'm getting a degree in early childhood education with the intent to homeschool my kids, and many parents I've met who started homeschooling did so because they had children with developmental disabilities that the school couldn't properly cater to. So I continue to be interested in what traditional schools do and don't offer to the general public. Therefore, it felt fairly natural for me to inquire about the inequities that remain in our educational system. Let's see, can I do this? Yes. So I chose to speak with an individual whom I recently met. Her name is Rosa Garcia, and we met at a soup kitchen in East LA called Casa Milagrosa. Currently, Rosa runs all the operations for the kitchen. She feeds, clothes, and provides occupational services to the poor. But prior to this role, she spent 2 years teaching third grade students in both general and special education. She loved the special education so much that she transferred to the LA Valley Charter School District, where she continued to teach strictly special ed to high schoolers. So she just seemed to have like the perfect mix of experience for this topic. There you'll see Casa Milagrosa, that's our food donation center. And then cool, our 2023 outcome was serving nearly 80,000 meals to the poor. So you'll recognize this material. You should hopefully. Universal Design Process Principles and Applications. I use this to highlight flexibility in use. And actually, I also use this for equitable design. We'll get to that, but equity in use, I think is what it's called. But for equity gaps for students with disabilities by Katie Pack, I use this to support the claims that I'll make about the socioeconomic and racial barriers to education placed before the disabled population. These are my resources that I brought from outside research, and I'm really excited to share you. One of them is a TED Talk with Dr. Burke. That kind of lays the foundation for an argument that I'll make that trauma can create learning disabilities. And then the second video, Dr. Burke is also in actually, but it's called Resilience, and it's going to just kind of drive home that perspective of a different perspective as to why kids enter a special education system. So here you'll see just my interview, my conversation with Rosa, just planning out our interview. So new learning here. So to start, quick overview of some of the broad ideas we'll discuss here, comparing the standard and specialized education as experienced through Rosa. Okay, so she talks about how with her experience in standard education, curriculum was more flexible, teachers were higher qualified. The students had less at-home traumas, and they were often of wealthier kids. Whereas in the special education system, she noted more students of minorities, specifically Hispanic. The curriculum was far less flexible. It was far more emotionally demanding, but she did have closer connections with the parents of the students themselves. So kind of for the remainder of this, we will be talking more about the special education, as that's Rosa's bread and butter. But for this slide here, in Los Angeles specifically, downtown LA, where Rosa was working. Many of the students in special education are of lower income Spanish-speaking homes. So one of the barriers to inclusion was the fact that the curriculum is taught in English. It's extremely challenging for native Spanish speakers to prove their proficiency in a subject. And some of these students could understand the content when tested in Spanish, but they weren't given credit for their knowledge when tested in English. Rosa noted this in both standard and special education, but it appeared to have a much greater barrier to success for those in the special ed classes. When asked what stereotypes affected the curriculum, Rosa mentioned that many teachers, almost solely the ones with limited special education training, felt that that those kids in special education could be held to the same standards as those without learning disabilities. And I initially thought that this sounded positive, like an equitable thinking, but she explained that it actually really hinders a child's learning, specifically their confidence and motivation. She talked about a time when a teacher that she worked alongside made all the students write a full page response to a prompt. But one of the students with intellectual disabilities would take 2 days to write a single paragraph. But the teacher insisted, no matter what, get it done by the end of the week. And despite Rosa's efforts to work with the student outside normal class hours, the student wasn't able to get more than half a page done. Rosa said that she tried really hard. She worked outside of school hours. She would come to school extra early to get it done and enlisted the help from multiple teachers to continue her edits. But despite her efforts, she only wrote half a page and actually got a D on the assignment. I call this misguided equity because it's well-intentioned, but ultimately leads to the feeling of failure within the striving student. Rosa stated that poor grades could affect a student's future achievements, stating that for some kids, a bad grade petrified them, and those who lost confidence and motivation rarely continued on to higher education. But on the flip side here, the English language arts teacher who had extensive experience and formal training in special education, he might propose something like the students write a full page in response to a prompt, but alternatively, they had the option of writing half a page and drawing the rest, which we've learned is a cornerstone of universal design. So I was kind of excited that our learnings kind of came to life in my interview. And so to touch upon the universal design of flexibility in design, that is really when the design is, it accommodates a wide range of individual preferences and abilities. For example, a museum that allows a visitor to choose to read or listen to the description of the contents on display. Rosa noted that students within that ELA class, not only did they have better grades because of this universality of their learning design, but they had more motivation and more enjoyment out of their studies. Economics played a huge role in the ability for disabled students to learn and benefit from the special education programs. Rosa listed many identifiers of the economic differences, of which we'll cover next, but what stood out to me most was the fact that children of lower income families often had obligations outside of school. Sometimes they would have to leave school early for a job or arrive late because they were taking care of a sibling or cleaning the house. And this put just a large strain on their educational progress. Some of these other identifiers of the economic differences would be wealthier kids. They lived farther from school, but had very reliable transportation. They showed up with clean clothes, money for lunch. They often had the resources to have outside help like tutors. And they showed up to class early to study, whereas the lower income kids often had, like I said, the obligations outside of school. They had to leave early or arrive late. They didn't have food, access to really nutritious food outside of school. And they often wore the same dirty clothes day in and day out. So we all likely read Equity Gaps for Students with Disabilities by Katie Pack. And she states that for every disability category, white students are in the minority and students of color represent the majority. I will show you in the next slide that that graph, if you will, but simultaneously, many of the students, the Black, Hispanic, Pacific Islander, Native American students, they are found in the urban school districts. So PAC suggests that the intersectionality between the greater ratio of minorities within a disability and their urban living increases the likelihood that a greater percentage of the disabled population attend low-income, poorly funded public schools. So PAC is basically saying that the racial barriers exacerbate the differences between the difficulties faced by the individuals with disabilities, right? The differences in their educational opportunities. And that these compounded barriers not only impede an individual's ability to thrive, but also perpetuates the cycle of poverty within their already marginalized community. So this is the graph I mentioned. You can see here on the far left, going down from autism, developmental delay, emotional disturbances, all the way down to visual impairment, that whites make up the smallest percentage. Super interesting. I recommend you guys go take another look at that. And just to take note that what Rose was saying directly mirrored what PAC had observed through her studies. So in regards to access, we'll kind of touch base upon curriculum again. Rosa stated that the rules around the curriculum are too strict, right? We know that they're not flexible. But we also, as previously mentioned, stated that a lot of students lack the elementary level of English grammar. So trying to teach a high school class that requires reflections in writing was nearly impossible. When the teachers approached the principal asking if the curriculum could be taught in Spanish to accommodate those who don't have English proficiency, the principal stated that the students are supposed to learn in English, right? Fair enough. I mean, I'll pose this question, you guys, at the end, but I don't personally know where the line is drawn. Students are learning in America. When they get in the real world, their English skills will be tested. So how much do we cater to this language barrier? But moreover, the teachers went back to the principal and asked about providing a program to give basic grammar lessons to those that didn't have that elementary English knowledge. And they thought, okay, like we can't teach the curriculum in Spanish, fine, cool, but can we help them learn English? And the principal rejected this idea, stating that the students should already have these skills and there's no room in the curriculum to teach English as a second language. Rosa stated that so many students were already behind because of their grammar, and they continue just to fall farther and farther behind, ultimately leading to them not passing the class or not graduating on time. And this really forced her and some of the other teachers to spend a lot of time outside the classroom, kind of guiding them through the assignment and essentially teaching them English when that was not her specialty either. She stated that the rigidity of the curriculum caused kids to continue to fall behind and required more from the teachers, increasing their burnout and turnover rate. And this is super important because the turnover rate affects the students as they have to now develop new relationships, rebuilding trust with their teachers, and especially for students with behavioral issues, for students that lack resources at home or might have, abusive relationships at home, and for students with like autism, these changes pose a great distraction to their education. So the strictness in curriculum reflects the equitable use principle I touched on earlier of universal design. So this is the second use of that article, in which requires the design to be useful and marketable to people with diverse abilities. For example, a website that is designed so that it is accessible to everyone, including people who are blind, or as you see in this photo, sliding doors that are useful for those that can and can't walk. So the curriculum simply was not accessible to all students. Now, as far as culture goes, one thing that really shocked me was that Rose stated that a lot of the children within the special education system do not have intellectual disabilities like autism. In fact, only about 20% of her kids had a learning disability, whereas 80% had behavioral issues or emotional disorders. Rosa blamed a lot of these behavioral issues on the culture within the homes, not necessarily like the ethnic culture, but the culture of disorder in the home. Many of the homes were fatherless or experienced substance abuse. But on a more positive note, Rosa also mentioned that the vast majority of her students, as we know, came from low-income Hispanic families, in which she found that the culture both aided and hindered the child's educational success. Whereas, so she stated that many Hispanic families are pretty large, right? And they all live communally. So that did lead to some kids having to, look after their younger siblings and stay away from school. But she mentioned that often, these mothers were the most involved, that their children, uh, she would have parent teacher meetings that sometimes lasted 2 or 3 hours to discuss a child's progress. And some of these mothers who were so involved, despite their lack of free time, they would meet with Rose every Wednesday morning to coach the parents through how to assist educating their child at home and just to see their progress in class. So this cultural aspect really aided the communal effort of a child's education. That was really interesting. Okay, so I'm super excited to introduce you guys to Dr. Burke Harris. She studied at Harvard and Stanford. She's a formal surgeon general, and now specializes in childhood trauma. So let's see how to escape this. Okay, let's hear from Dr. Burke.
And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach. When I finished my residency, I wanted to go someplace where I felt really needed, someplace where I could make a difference. So I came to work for California Pacific Medical Center, one of the best private hospitals in Northern California. And together, we opened a clinic in Bayview, Hunters Point, one of the poorest, most underserved neighborhoods in San Francisco. Now, prior to that point, there had been only one pediatrician in all of Bayview to serve more than 10,000 children. So we hung a shingle, and we were able to provide top quality care regardless of ability to pay. It was so cool. We targeted the typical health disparities: access to care, immunization rates, asthma hospitalization rates, and we hit all of our numbers. We felt very proud of ourselves. But then I started noticing a disturbing trend. A lot of kids were being referred to me for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But when I actually did a thorough history and physical, what I found was that for most of my patients, I couldn't make a diagnosis of ADHD. Most of the kids I was seeing had experienced such severe trauma that it felt like something else was going on. Somehow, I was missing something important. Now, before I did my residency, I did a master's degree in public health. And one of the things that they teach you in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well, and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics, or you can walk over and say, what the hell is in this well? So I began reading everything that I could get my hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And then one day, my colleague walked into my office and he said, Dr. Burke, have you seen this? In his hand.
Okay, so I will actually explain just for time's sake. In his hand was the study conducted in the 90s and done by Dr. Bob Anda from the CDC and Vince Folletti from Kaiser. Together, they asked 17,500 adults, middle-class Caucasians down in San Diego, about what they called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. They asked about physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, parental separation, substance dependence, or domestic violence. They then correlated the amount of ACEs scoring on a 0 to 10 scale, correlated the ACEs to health outcomes in adulthood. The study was so conclusive that it was revolutionary in the more ACEs someone had, the worse their health was, having higher risk of pulmonary disease, hepatitis, lung cancer, heart disease. And this was the case even for the people that did not engage in high risk activity. They originally thought, okay, well, yes, if you have a lot of trauma, you might be leaning on drinking or smoking, recreational drugs, all of that. But those that did not engage in any high risk activities, they didn't drink, smoke, they didn't have multiple sex partners, their health outcomes were also far worse based on their childhood adverse experiences or adverse childhood experiences. Where this relates to what we're talking about is in kids with scores of 4 or more on the ACE test, 4 out of 10 or more, that had traumatic experiences producing what was coined toxic stress, we'll talk about it in a minute, they were 32 times more likely to have a learning or behavioral problem in school. Why? I'm going to let Redford explain why here in this video called Resilience. This is also actually Dr. Burke, but she's just one of the many doctors in this video.
But here's the thing about it
That may have occurred in your family.
we found that for kids at the Bayview Child Health Center, if they had an ACE score of 4 or more, they were 32 times as likely to have learning and behavior problems in school. 32 times as likely, right? Than if you had an ACE score of 0.
The reality is that we all need a certain amount of stress, a certain amount of anxiety to perform well. If we don't care about that exam that we're going to have tomorrow, we'll probably fail. If we're going to cross the street and a truck is coming at us, we have release of adrenaline. We have release of a hormone that we call cortisol. We want to jump out of there, and adrenaline and cortisol are going to help us do that. So there's that good amount of stress. But if all day long you're feeling like a truck is coming at you, day after day after day, that's going to take a toll on the body. And the amygdala obviously here has greater activation.
Yes.
In the PTSD. We were able to image children that had experienced trauma and compare those brain images with children that didn't have an experience of trauma and didn't have symptoms.
Right, an exaggerated fear response.
An exaggerated fear response with decreased activation in areas that we need to control that emotion in the frontal areas.
Exposure to early adversity and trauma literally affects the structure and function of children's developing brains. So the kid next to them hits them, or the teacher reprimands them in a way that they're uncomfortable with, right? Literally what they're feeling, that activation is like there was a truck coming at them.
I should have put those captions on for you earlier. I hope you could hear that. And if not, I highly recommend you go watch the rest of these videos. It is truly fascinating. I think this is stuff I'll never forget. So as I mentioned, Dr. Anda, let's go back to the slideshow. Dr. Anda and Folletti, they coined the term called toxic stress, when a person experiences strong, frequent, or prolonged activity of the body's stress responses in absence of buffering, protection of supportive adult relationships. So really this has me questioning, like, how many children in our special education system, given that if they have this constant these traumatic stresses that cause this constant and prolonged activation of the body's stress responses, and from that they're 32 times as likely to have learning or behavioral disabilities, and that Rose is saying that 80% of her students have learning or have rather behavioral disabilities. And I didn't mention earlier, she did say that ADHD was one of the most common ones that she saw, in which we also hear Dr. Burke say she's getting a ton of kids that are coming in for these diagnoses of ADHD, but she has no clinical basis for these diagnoses. So how many of the students in special education are actually there simply because of these stresses of traumatic experiences? And how do we resolve this? I will touch base on a couple of solutions here. Now, these are solutions in the next two slides provided by Rosa herself, but I tend to agree. To resolve the issues of inflexible curriculum and inflexible educators, Rosa proposes that teachers and admin at all levels, from the counselors to the principals, should be required to have special education training. With hands-on experience and to know what social factors often drive a kid to special education, like trauma, home life, instigators of poor behavior, to learn how to teach in a more humanistic way. And then the problems of social behaviors, social and behavioral issues rather, masked as learning disabilities, as talked about by Dr. Burke. Rosa believes a greater focus on social emotional treatment and funding for child's basic needs must be prioritized. She says children should not be leaving school thinking that they won't eat until they return. They should not have to worry about working jobs or caring for siblings in place of learning. And part of their basic necessities include social emotional support. You know, children need to be supported through programs like the ACE curriculum that can reduce the anxiety and psychological effects of trauma and that exacerbate learning disabilities. If I didn't mention before, the research done on the ACE test produced a curriculum, as I just mentioned, the ACE curriculum, that basically teaches kids how to express emotions and stresses through a productive manner. I think they teach kids as young as kindergarten all through high school. Um, Super cool, and I would love to get my hands on that curriculum if anyone listening has access to that. And then lastly, continued inquiry. So this is really when I leave it to you guys, like, should special education programs cater to those with language barriers? If so, how? And I guess if not, why not? And how can what we learned from Dr. Burke Harris and the film on resilience inform us about how to take a different approach to behavioral and learning disabilities? Thank you so much for listening. Resources here if you want to go back to any of them. And I look forward to getting your feedback. Let's see here. Stop sharing. Thank you.